Excellent.
We're recording, Harry.
So it's very nice to see a few more people this week. That's great. I'd like to welcome our three scholars who are going to share their PhD projects with us today. We're going to start with Sarah Crawford-Browne from the University of Cape Town. She is clearly a woman of great brave tendencies, in that she is telling us that she is used to going into high violence neighborhoods, and she's going to talk about that work this afternoon. She's currently teaching medical humanities to preclinical medical students at the University of Cape Town. You had 20 years of clinical social work practice, Sarah, before this, and you talk about most of your work being in Cape Town high violence communities, but also 6 years in post-conflict Sierra Leone, which interestingly also David and Clare have been working, and also Pakistan and Afghanistan. So this shows that our approach is not afraid to tackle the most knotty world problems. You write, in my travels, I saw resonance between traumatic stress presentations of clients in South Africa, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Northern Uganda, with, quote, safer Sierra Leone and Pakistan tending to present with a more classical PTSD presentation. Clinicians within South Africa, Latin America, and Northern Ireland have been writing about continuous traumatic stress, which you're going to be talking about. I guess a lot of us therapists are more used to thinking of trauma as having happened once, many years ago. This is going to be immersion in continuous traumatic stress. So welcome to the Meetup series, Sarah, and looking forward to hearing you speak.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity. Let's just see if I can do this magical screen share. Right. Okay. And now I am. It's amazing how one's mind goes absolutely blank about how to do things you do every day.
Absolutely.
And I don't want that. And I want that. Great. And so, greetings to you all. I assume my screen is with you, and you can all see where I work in Hanover Park. So, greetings to you all from Cape Town, where we're enjoying spring, and I imagine that most of you are gradually moving into cooler weather.
Yes.
And I want to thank you to the committee for organizing the series. It's been a wonderful opportunity for me because I'm not otherwise really connected into the PCP network. And so this has been a fantastic space for me to learn and grow. And I want to just thank you for this opportunity to share my research. My research has been considering how people adapt to living in a dangerous neighborhood. So hence the title, Creating Safety in a Dangerous Place, Expressions of Continuous Traumatic Stress. My PhD arose, as you've gathered, from my clinical work with people working in people living in marginalized communities in Cape Town that were devastated by apartheid's forced removal policies and that are now affected with high levels of structural violence, poverty, and gangsterism, very much a neighborhood like this photograph. These are contexts where people are anticipating violence, and therefore this challenges our ideas of post-traumatic stress because the violence is ongoing. And in this presentation, I'm going to skip through some of the methodological issues because I really want to discuss my findings and some of the implications with you. So this study considered how adult women's well-being might be affected by living in a context of ongoing violence. Operationalized as how do women live in a neighborhood with high levels of violence, and how do they construe their context, and how do they then adapt to this construal? Underpinning the study is an understanding that people adapt to their construal of an experience, with their construal processes shaping their adaptations. As you know, constructivist trauma theories offer diverse approaches to understanding the impact of life-threatening experiences, including Sewell and his team theorizing that people who've been traumatized may have disruptions in social and event domains, in their domains of construal, and that they may be struggling with construct bankruptcy or dissociated construction, or may move into elaborative growth. Semprezes and Winter contest this, suggesting that trauma is over-elaborated into a superordinate organizing construct that dominates a person's construal. And Leitner proposes that traumatic stress impacts awareness in the way that may affect inclusion within construct systems. Robert Niemeyer has written extensively about the impact of trauma and grief, where narratives may be dominated, disorganized, or dissociated by the processing of traumatic experiences. So we've got a lot of different ideas. And in my work, I'm beginning to think a lot about what is the role of slot rattling in traumatic stress. And that might be something that we might discuss as we come up, as we look at this work. I've chosen a constructivist grounded theory as a methodology that could step out of the current Western diagnostic categories to engage with the participants' perspectives and thereby generate an original theory useful for clinical practice in marginalized communities. And I've situated my study in Hanover Park as a typical neighborhood in Cape Town. It's a tiny, overcrowded community, about 2 kilometers square, with 40,000 people living there. High levels of severe poverty. And it's one of the most violent communities worldwide, with a high level of gang conflict and drug sales. The murder rate is more than double than Cape Town, 4 times that of South Africa, and about 23 times the global average. So it's a hotspot for violence. I interviewed 21 adult women who were simply patients at the local clinic, eliciting their life narratives over 2 interviews, averaging about 3 hours with each participant. And then through focused and theoretical coding of the transcripts, I found that the participants had a shared central construal of their context, and drew on similar adaptive psychological processes. When interacting with most of the participants during the interviews, my first impressions were that they had normalized the contextual violence and that they were coping, at least on the surface. But when I formally analyzed the transcripts, I found that all participants construed their neighborhood as life-threateningly dangerous, with this impacting their sense of safety and freedom. Universally, they mistrusted neighbors and hated the perceived social chaos, leading to feelings of alienation. 2/3 of the participants were preoccupied with surviving just the daily stresses of poverty. The focus coding established that the participants construed their neighborhood using 2 shared central construct systems, identified as anticipating danger and mistrusting others, with associated feelings of fear and alienation. They also worried about the daily stresses, with this forming a 3rd category. And then the participants' responses were held in 2 categories of constructing safety and affirming decency. To give a sense of the participants' comments and the subconstructs, when anticipating danger, participants spoke of Hanover Park as being now the coffin. Other quotations and subconstructs included So that was when they were anticipating direct danger, but also witnessing, when they were witnessing violence, they spoke of people is just dying here and repeated and discussed many incidences. They were navigating a diffuse ethos of threat, where they spoke of a person can't see a bullet. And they feared revenge. If a person gets rude with a gangster, then he'll retaliate. And these are their neighbors. They were worrying about family members whenever they heard shooting in the area, and said that I'm immediately on my nerves, and started wondering where everybody was. Frequently, the participants made comments like, we don't even know which side we're safe. And this suggested implicit poles of missing safety and missing freedom. Frequently, the participants made comments, the participants divided the community between those involved with the violence and those who are not, and then spoke of hating the chaos and associating that with immorality. And within mistrusting others, the participants spoke about the community being like Sodom and Gomorrah, to describe how they just hated the chaos and thought it was of biblical proportions and very immoral. And then when we looked at other themes within this, there was a sense that they were expecting hurt and fearing gossip. All the participants feared gossip, with this being a strong theme within their narratives. Participants spoke about sometimes people can be very nasty, and they feared interacting with their neighbors. Much of their energy in the narratives was spent in identifying who was involved in the chaos and the illicit activity, and who was deemed innocent, with this often not being how I understood their narratives. So they found many people innocent who sounded quite involved in the chaos and in the gang fights. When they spoke about those specifically involved in the gang fights, they spoke it's the gangsters and the drugs. Some participants acknowledged complicity, and that the boundary between those who were involved and those who were not involved was quite porous, saying everybody gets involved or caught up in this. So again, within these themes, all participants spoke about feeling alienated and how they were seeking connection, with this seeming to be an implicit pole. Quite a strong theme, with some people saying things like, we can encourage each other. So the third category, conceptualized as worrying about daily survival, held all the remaining codes, where participants spoke at length about their daily worries about hunger, finances, and parenting difficulties, their ill health that they often related to poverty or stress, and the challenges of living within overcrowded housing with substance abuse and domestic violence. These construct systems were complex, including positive elements and valued community characteristics, alongside recognizing danger and chaos. And at once this was a shared construal, this shared construal seemed rather unsurprising given the context that the participants were living in that it seemed obvious that they would anticipate danger and mistrust others. However, there were only 5 participants who were overwhelmed with this construal affecting their daily functioning. And all of those who were overwhelmed all had a history of developmental trauma, child abuse, neglect, domestic violence. And they tended to merge their past traumas with their current experience and seeing it all as one in a messy situation. Most participants said that they had got used to the situation and that they could cope. And I think this leads to how they were adapting. And I found that most participants responded to their context by constructing psychological safety. And within constructing psychological safety, there was shifting of their awareness away from the violence through a number of mechanisms. Some were conscious and they had a bipolar construal of the threat, where they were able to speak with a high awareness of what was going on around them. For instance, the boys who are recruited are all young dropouts, and they were able to speak in great detail about what this was about. Others were involved in constricting their elaborations of threat and had quite many avoidance strategies. For instance, they would say, our lives are in God's hands, not in their hands. Or they would say, I put my mind away from all of that, and then I don't worry anymore. Other participants created rules and maps for safety, and I thought this was something of a construct alternativism, where they would say, have rules like be on time in your home or clean your stairs. Or they would map safe and dangerous areas, and they'd say like, no, we'll go into the back room, or I'll walk on this street. And they used these rules and maps to construct a sense of safety, and then stopped thinking much about the violence. The participants also focused on their overwhelming daily demands. And this is sort of summarized in this idea of there's a lot of other things going on. So within this, they constructed a sense of safety, and their awareness shifted away from the dangers. There was also a sense of, of affirming decency, sorry. There's also a sense of affirming decency. And within this affirming decency, they were finding connections with those who were on the right side of the community, who were not involved in the illicit activities. So some were able to connect with self and able to say, I'm going to concentrate on myself from now on, often having been quite involved in community work. I saw some role constriction, which they used to distance from the violence, often idealizing the sense of being a community worker and their role as a community worker, and say things like, the community worker is there for the people, and that's my calling. And so then being able to associate with those who are decent in that way. And then there were those who were protecting their respectability while recognizing complicity. Allah first, and then me, and then I'll go out with a smile, often saying that they would always make sure that they stepped out best foot forward, so that they would be seen to be respectable. So they were conscious of how they appeared to others. So I found that most were able to respond to their context, and many of these adaptations seemed to involve slot rattling. And indeed, the participants spoke of feeling safe, but that this changed instantly when danger presented or when they were exposed to violence. Mm-hmm. And that resonated a lot with my experience in practice, where I found that they moved very quickly from a sense of great fear to then feeling more safe. So, in short, I found that my participants construed their neighbourhood by anticipating danger and mistrusting others, and then responded by constructing safety and affirming decency. And I found that they did this using 4 patterns. There were 3 participants who seemed to be managing consciously, where they constructed safety by consciously using a bipolar construal of danger. There were 5 who I described as controlling chaos. And there seemed to be greater disruptions in their social domains of construal, and they drew more heavily on role construction. There were 6 who were passively distancing, and there seemed to be more disruption in the event domain, and they relied more on rules and maps for constructing safety. And then there were 5 or so who were overwhelmed by their context, where their past experiences of violence merged with current. And I've been playing with the idea that their narratives resonate with integrated narratives, dominant narratives, dissociated and disorganized narratives, respectively. and playing and trying to make sense of some of that. And then, yeah, I think pulling it all together, right now I'm puzzling. What is supporting the slot rattling? And is this what's happening? And is this because their construct systems have been invalidated, periodically invalidated because they don't experience violence all the time? Or is this supported by the underlying processes that they are working with? So that's a summary of of my work and where I've been going. And I really enjoy talking with you more about this. And thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you.
We're going to have the three speakers present sequentially and leave discussion till afterwards, because we could get well into a discussion and then time goes flying by. But do note down at this point, while it's fresh in your mind, the questions that you might want to ask Sarah. So let me move on to Clare now, Clare Mason. Clare is doing her PhD supervised by David Winter, who is present, at the University of Hertfordshire. I'll read that she says, by way of background, I came to psychology following a career change. Prior to this, I'd worked in both public and private sectors. This included working in West and Southern Africa. So we continue the African theme, managing development programs for the EU, and also working for the British government as consultant in biotechnology and in developing agricultural policy to benefit the environment. In the private sector, she worked in pharmaceutical industry and for several years as senior clinical research scientist, designing and managing multinational clinical trials. She's co-authored a book with David Winter, Rachel Brown, Stephanie Goins, called Trauma, Survival and Resilience in War Zones, the Psychological Impact of War in Sierra Leone, and refugee case studies using PCP research methodology. So let me hand over to you, Clare, before wasting any more time. Welcome, Clare Mason.
Thank you. You can see that. Right, so thanks very much, Harry. So I was hoping to speak to you all about the radicalization of political campaigners. So what I'm really interested in with my PhD is why people want to undertake personally costly actions for a cause. So if we look at these pictures here, they're of pro and anti-Trump supporters. And as we can see, at the very least, this looks physically painful. So I'm interested to know, why would you want to do that? So I'm coming from two perspectives. Firstly, from identity fusion. Now, this is grounded in social identity theory. It's about how an individual becomes so attached or so fused to their group that they then are willing to undertake these personally costly actions. So we have local fusion, where you have strong relational ties with members of small groups like a family. And in this picture, this is my 3 children, showing quite strong relational ties here, looking quite close. I have to add, they don't always. And there's extended fusion, where individuals project this familiar relational tie onto large collectives with whom they have no personal relationship. So also I have a PCP perspective and the constructivist model of radicalization. Now, this proposes that radicalization follows a major invalidation of the individuals construing, particularly their core constructs, and that those with undifferentiated or inflexible construct systems may be more vulnerable. So with their limited way of viewing events, if their construct systems are invalidated, it's more difficult for them to find an alternative understanding. So we think they'd be more vulnerable. Now, as you can imagine, having invalidation of superordinate structures, including your core constructs, would leave you with a great sense of uncertainty and a real intense anxiety. Excuse me. And we think radical beliefs can address this by providing a very certain, a very extreme worldview. And with this often comes a corresponding change in sense of identity. So as people look for an ideological framework to help restore a sense of certainty, it's often associated with a specific group, and then they have a new core role as a member of that group, so a change in their identity. So we think radicalization involves extreme negative views of a target group, and this would facilitate a more positive view of your own group and yourself. And that radical constructions are validated by contact with similar thinking others, so that often social contacts are reduced to just being with those who validate your new construing. And we think violence may be reconstrued as acceptable and a legitimate form of action, so it can be undertaken without association with guilt. And we think similar processes occur both in the in-group and the out-group, so it creates this vicious cycle. So how would you study it? Well, obviously it's very difficult to reach population, but we thought that demonstrators might be an accessible group who might exhibit extreme pro-group behaviour. I think a lot of us are aware of demonstrations that tip over into violent clashes. So to find two demonstrating groups, I was looking at Brexit and Black Lives Matter. And what I wanted to know was fusion, was it actually existing there within these campaign groups? And if it did, was it, as is proposed, was it associated with extreme behaviour? And I was also really interested to know how these political campaigners construe and whether there's a difference between those who were fused and not fused. So we expect all group members to behave in a similar manner, independent of what the cause is. And Brexit provided this kind of perfect opportunity. It was a dichotomous situation, and I had access to both of the opposing groups under the same conditions. So what I did was, in the wind and the rain in London, approaching Leave and Remain demonstrators outside the British Houses of Parliament in the final year of the prolonged Brexit process. So with Black Lives Matter, so that's a movement that was established in 2013, and that was in response to the disproportionate amount of state violence on the Black community. Now, we saw a lot more demonstrations last year following the murder of George Floyd. So I approached US-based supporters through the Qualtrics electronic survey platform. So with my measures, firstly, I wanted to know, were people fused? So I used a 7-item measure with questions like, I feel immersed in my group. Also had a similar 7-item measure, but this is measuring the willingness to fight for the group with questions such as, I would fight someone who was insulting or making fun of my group. From a methodology that was developed amongst the conflict in the Middle East, had questions about political violence, which includes damage to property and persons. And that was if the group was to be dismantled and if the group, to gain the change that group was looking for. It had a trolley dilemma, and the adaptation here was that obviously the participants could choose to do nothing, or they could sacrifice themselves by throwing themselves onto the track to save 5 fellow campaigners, or in the second scenario, they could save either 5 opposition supporters or just 1 fellow campaigner. And it also had a repertory grid. So I was really interested to see how campaigners construed themselves before and since activism, and also their ideal self. Also looked at how they construed fellow campaigners, 3 examples of that. So it would be people they know personally or somebody in the public eye, and similarly for opposition campaigners, and also for a neutral individual who's not interested in their cause. Now, when it came to the constructs, I listed these using the triadic method with the first 10 participants of the Brexit study. And what I noticed, and what was also why I was interested in doing a standardized grid, was that there was a lot of commonality in the constructs, both within and between groups. So both Leave and Remain were coming forward with similar constructs. So these are like to do with political engagement and democracy and so on. And I kept this standardized grid also for the Black Lives Matter, so I thought it would also be relevant there. So what did we find? Well, we found quite a high amount of fusion, so 71% in the Brexit campaign. What was interesting here is it's exactly the same for both the Leave and the Remain group. And in the BLM sample, it was 76%. But what I captured in the survey was whether people were active demonstrators or whether they were supporters from home, as it were. And amongst those who were actively demonstrating, the fusion rate, as you can see, was extremely high at 95%. And just to give you a bit of context, this compares to Swan's original study, where they found 41% of Spanish students refused to their nationality to Spain following a terrorist attack. So as far as willingness to fight is concerned, yes, those who refused were more willing to fight for the group in Brexit and Black Lives Matter. And within Brexit, it was the same between Leave and Remain. What was quite exciting with this is that the scores for the fusion measure were actually predictive of the scores on the willingness to fight. So we think this potentially could be developed as a measure of assessing pro-group behaviour with slightly less face validity than asking, are you going to hurt someone? In the political violence, again, those who refused from all the groups, they were all more willing to get involved than non-fused. What was interesting with the Brexit group is that this was only for to stop their group being dismantled. So the integrity of the group was extremely important within the Brexit group. And again, with the trolley dilemma, fused participants were more likely to sacrifice themselves. But again, what was interesting here was that this was heightened and more people were willing to sacrifice themselves to save just one fellow campaigner when there were 5 opposition campaigners present. So they were more willing to do that than to sacrifice themselves for 5 fellow campaigners. So I think that talks a little bit about the presence of the opposition group. So if we look at construing, with the average grids of Leave and Remain, they were extremely closely correlated, and this was especially so for those who refused. And looking at the tightness in construing, so the flexibility in the construct system, we did find relatively tight systems. And again, this was higher in those who refused, particularly in the BLM supporters. And there were similarly tight systems with Leave and Remain too. So in both studies, becoming a campaigner brought participants closer to their ideal self. So they construed themselves more positively on becoming a campaigner. And again, this was greater for fused individuals. So unsurprisingly, opposition campaigners were construed more negatively than fellow campaigners. But what was interesting here was that it was correlated with the measurement of willingness to fight for the group. So again, potentially another way of assessing for pro-group extreme behaviour with less face validity by working with a repertory grid rather than asking people, again, if they're going to fight. So opposition campaigners are also found to hold more meaning than fellow campaigners. And again, this was amplified in fused participants. So I did find a difference between the 2 studies in the discriminatory powers of the constructs within the repertory grid. If we look at Brexit, it's all to do with democracy, and both sides, both Leave and Remain, contested the democratic power of what had been going on, and whether MPs were behaving with integrity, and that for both groups it was really important for them to be activists and to be demonstrating. If we look at the Black Lives Matter, if we look at the positive and the positive polls, looking at likable, compassionate, kind, and these sort of qualities we don't associate with violence, which is what they were really campaigning for. So I think the constructs really reflect the differences in the campaigns. So just to conclude, we find similar observations in all of the groups, Leave, Remain, and Black Lives Matter. And so we think these findings show that it's a function of group alignment, group dynamics, rather than the actual cause people are fighting for. And the findings are supportive of identity fusion theory. We found fused were more willing to undertake the extreme acts. We found differences in construing as well. And as I mentioned, the predictive ability of the fusion score and the willingness to fight for the group shows a way of perhaps potentially being able to assist with an assessment of the likelihood of pro-group behaviour. I think we must remember the high proportion of individuals we found were fused because they're more likely, hypothetically, to undertake extreme pro-group behaviour, and need to be wary of that. So the positive self-view on becoming a campaigner, we think likely motivates individuals to begin and to maintain their political activism. And the extreme negative construing we found of opposition campaigners allows individuals to construe themselves more positively. And again, this might be a motivator for campaigning. And as those who viewed opposition campaigners more negatively were more willing to fight for the group, as I mentioned, it suggests that the repertory grid technique could be a useful way, perhaps, of looking at potential pro-group extreme behaviour. So our findings have provided support for the constructivist model, showing particularly the less adaptable way of construing, the extreme negative construing of the opposition, and that similar processes occur in opposing groups. So we saw that particularly in Brexit. And this is consistent with previous work with Salafist Muslims and with looking at the narrative of Anders Breivik, who was the Norwegian who tragically shot a lot of political campaigners. So finally, I would just really like to emphasise that I don't think Brexit and Black Lives Matter campaigners, they are far from being terrorists, but we think perhaps the process in which some become willing to undertake these pro-group behaviours, it may follow the same pathway as individuals who go on to progress much further. And in this way, I think campaigning groups can provide us with a useful insight to the subject of radicalisation and its often tragic consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Fascinating and full of implications, I'm sure, for intervening and educating people,
yes,
hopefully away from what is really a process in common, whatever the content, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
But let's move on now to Adrià. Adrià did his bachelor's degree at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and then a master's degree research in behavior and cognition at the University of Barcelona. And he's using repertory grid technique in order to study how people may use virtual environments such as online video games in order to explore alternative identities and how self-esteem plays a factor in that said exploration. So another very topical issue in the third of our presentations. So Adrià, would you like to take the stand?
Thank you, Harry. Let's see. Okay. As Harry said, my current research regards about how online video game players may construe virtual identity through their video game characters. It's interesting that for a while, since they began, at first, video game research was mainly focused on the behavioral effects, mostly how, especially over teenagers and children, how they may be related to aggressive or violent behavior. But in the more recent years, especially since the appearance of online video games, it seems that the focus has shifted to a research that's more focused on how video game players relate to one another, and especially how they relate to their characters. Previous research observed a phenomenon where video game players had a tendency to create a virtual character that resembled more an ideal version of themselves rather than how they saw themselves actually. It was a phenomenon that was modulated by several variables, among them the immersion they experienced when playing or their own self-esteem. And for a while that was fairly researched, how they used video games in order to like project their ideal identity on their characters. However, other research observed another effect called identity tourism, where people through online video games or other virtual environments such as social media, they used this anonymity and this possibility to create different identities, to explore completely different personalities than their own, without the necessity that for those new identities to be an idealized version of themselves, just for the inherent satisfaction of exploring different personas. Naturally, when we deal with such abstract concepts such as identity and self, I like to get a bit of some definitions, mainly because there are so many and very different. In this case, we decided for a more broad and global definition by Oyserman, Elmore, and Smith, who viewed identity as a collection of values and traits that we use in order to define ourselves and to differentiate us from others. And in this case, the notion of self would be the awareness of those traits as being a part of us. Now, these traits, of course, are stable a long time, but they do tend to be very context dependent. We do not show necessarily the same traits when we are among family, in our jobs, when we are presenting in a constructivist meeting, and this this phenomenon, which has been named the community of selves, deals with precisely this notion, the notion that we don't have just one identity, but that our identity is a collection of different facets that we express depending on the environment. Within this concept, we bring up the idea of virtual identity, which is the facet of the self that we express when we are in virtual environments such as social networks, online video games, etc. Our main objectives is to study how online video game players construe their virtual identity using a constructivist framework, where we're using the personal construct theory, and besides the two main elements of the self, the actual self, which shows how a person sees themselves, and the ideal self, showing how they would like to be, we added another element, which we call the virtual self. In this case, it would be, in the case of, in a more broader sense, it would be how the person sees their virtual representation in a virtual environment. In an online video game, it would be the person's virtual avatar. Our main hypothesis is that according to how similar or different a video game player sees their ideal and their virtual self, there can be two main ways in which they construe their virtual identity. The first one we call the projection type, which is a situation where a video game player sees their actual self to be very different from their ideal self, and then they create a virtual self that resembles more this ideal one. An example of what has been observed in previous research. The second would be the exploration type, which is which follows the phenomenon of identity tourism. And it's a situation where a person already sees their ideal self as very similar to their actual self, and then they create a virtual self that resembles neither how they see themselves or how they want to be, just for the inherent rewarding experience of exploring a new identity. And the third one we call the proximal type, which is a situation where, regardless of how they see their ideal self and their actual self, a video game player does not perceive a difference between themselves within and outside of the game. would be people who don't construct a virtual identity that's really different from their own. We do have another type, which we call the unspecified type, which would be a situation where the three elements of the self were at the same distance from one another. We added this because we considered it to be mathematically possible. However, it's not contemplated in previous research, nor how it could, nor what it could imply. So we don't expect that many people would fall under this category, if at all. A secondary hypothesis, we do believe that there are several variables, both about the person and about the game they are playing, that can be related to specific types within our typology, and can serve as modulators for this distance between the elements of the self. The one we had the game-related variables, such as the immersion they experience when playing. We predict that the more immersed the players are, they will experience, they will manifest a bigger distance between the actual and the virtual self. And also the motivation, the main motivation that leads them to want to play the game. We believe that people who are more motivated by the competitive aspects of a video game will tend more to this proximal type, such as since they would not perceive their character as a social instrument, more like a competitive one. So they wouldn't have such a big tendency to explore different identities in the game. On the other hand, people who are more motivated by the social aspects of a game will tend to fall more into the projection or exploration type. Also, for the personal variables of the person, we will have their psychological well-being, which we consider that the lower psychological well-being they have, the smaller will be the distance between the virtual and the ideal self, as well as the identity, the cognitive conflicts that can arise in identity construal, such as implicative dilemmas. We believe that the higher level of conflict also will lead to a smaller distance between the virtual and the ideal self. And lastly, of course, we have the self-esteem. We believe that people who fall within the projection type will tend to have a lower self-esteem than the rest. So our aim is to gather a sample of 200 online video game players who we are contacting through online forums and other social media. We, as inclusion criteria, we only need that they play regularly, that they have an active account, and we will exclude people who play while under the effects of recreational drugs or while inebriated, and also professional players. In order to assess this distance between the different elements of the self, of course, we will administrate the repertory grid technique with a modification where along with their actual and the ideal self, we are adding the virtual self, where we ask them to think about their main character, the one they play with the most. Once we administrate the grid, we measure how similar or different are the actual, virtual, and ideal selves, as well as their cognitive conflicts. And for the other variables, we administrate a series of questionnaires that are which are administrated through an online forum. An online survey. When we reach out to people on the forums, we send them a link with the informed consent form where they can sign it. And once they agree to participate, they are redirected to they follow up to a survey where we administrate these instruments, and afterwards we schedule an online interview where we administrate the repertory grid. The first one of these instruments is the CORE-OM, 34-item questionnaire where we measure their psychological well-being. We also administrate the personal experience of need satisfaction, which is a 21-item scale divided in 5 subscales. That basically it measures the level in which different necessities of a person are met when playing a certain game. From this, we will use the immersion subscale to see how much immersion they experience when playing, and also the relatedness subscale and the competence subscale, which respectively measure how much the game satisfies a person's social needs and competitive needs. Lastly, we also administrate the Rosenberg self-esteem scale to evaluate our participants' self-esteem. Once we have gathered all the data, we will carry out a K-means cluster analysis, which calculates a series of centroids in order to divide a given data in a pre-specified number of groups according to some variables. So we will use this clustering method in order to divide our participants in the groups that we predicted with our typology according to the distance between their ideal, their virtual, and their actual selves. Once we have our data divided in these groups, we will label them according to our typology, and then we will carry out a series of one-way ANOVAs in order to see if the difference between those groups are actually significant. And once we have done that, we will carry out other analysis, such as multiple linear regression models, which we will use to actually see if there is a link between, for example, the level of immersion and the distance between actual and virtual self, and whether or not there is a link between the distance between the virtual and ideal self and their levels of cognitive conflict and psychological well-being. We will also carry out another series of one-way ANOVAs, which will serve us to see if there is a difference between those groups in their self-esteem or in their competitive motivation and in their social motivation. So far, we have gathered only 29 participants, which it's still too small to make the cluster analysis or the ANOVAs in a proper and accurate way. But we already have made very rough estimations about where the participants we have interviewed would fall within our typology. Again, these are very rough estimations. We have 9 participants who, if our typology was validated, could fit into the projection type. We have 17 people who could fit into the exploration type, 2 people who would be proximal type players, and we even have one that could possibly belong to the unspecified equidistant type. So here I brought a few examples of our participants. As you can see, this person experiences a very elevated distance between their actual self and their ideal self, and also their virtual self. I don't know if you can see my mouse right now, but the virtual self they construct is also very different from themselves, from their actual self, but is much closer to the ideal one. This person, if our typology was validated, could belong to the projection type. On the other hand,
Adria, yes. Can I just ask, I might have missed it earlier, but when you ask them for what their virtual self is, how do you define that? How do you put that into words?
In this case, yes, I mentioned it very briefly. So thank you for your question. In this case, we are asking them about their main character, the character they play with the most. We understand that that a single person can create several characters, and they can create them with different strategies. They can create an avatar that's there through the projection type Construal, and they can have a whole other character that was created through the exploration type Construal. But since we are here trying to validate a very new typology, we thought we would keep it brief and a bit simpler by only asking them about the one they play with the most.
If on the grid you, for ideal self, you say, please rate yourself as you would like to be.
Yes.
How do you put how do you capture the virtual?
I usually ask them to think about before we carry the interview. I ask them to think about their main character, the character they play with the most.
So you would like to, the person you would like to be like?
I ask them to answer the questions about how they see themselves, about how they would like to be.
Yeah.
And then the virtual self, we include them as talking about their character. I say, how do you think your character is?
Okay, so how does that differ from them just as the character as an element? What makes
the character the character is included as an element, but since the character is controlled by the person, we believe that there is an element of identity construal in it. After all, the character is the means through which the person interacts with the virtual environment, and the means through which this person interacts with other players is by character to character interaction.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So yes, as I was saying, we would also have this other grid where the distance between the actual self and the ideal self is fairly small, and the virtual self is more separated from both the actual and the ideal self, which, if our typology was validated, could lead to an exploration type of virtual self construal. So we do have some limitations for this research. On the one hand, we only explore the virtual self construct within an online video game. We don't contemplate other kinds of virtual environments such as social networks. We also we also use a very time-consuming instrument such as the Repertory grid, and the need of a larger sample combined with the long process of administrating the grid can make the data gathering process quite challenging, although we have been managing so far.
Good.
And I also believe that the duration of the interview, the amount of time it takes, it also may be able to affect the kind of person that would be not only available for participating, but also willing to participate. Some people may be taken aback by that. But if this typology was validated, it could lead to other ways of future research. As I said, if it was validated, we could replicate the study in other virtual environments such as social media to see if this typology also happens within the social media such as social networks, Facebook, etc. On another direction, we could try to replicate the study on tabletop role-playing games, which despite lacking the anonymity of virtual environments, they are also an environment that stimulates and that encourages the creation of alternative identities. So it would be interesting to replicate the study in those environments to see if the lack of anonymity affects the typology in some way. On another line of research, it could be useful also in therapies regarding video game addiction, since if the typology was validated, it could be very possible that different types of players could benefit from different approaches in therapy. And that's it. This would be the references from the slides, and thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you very much. Well, we've had 3 fascinating accounts of research. I think we should begin to discuss these. I'm not sure whether we should take each speaker in turn or whether we should just leave it open. I'm concerned that each speaker has a nice chunk of discussion about their project. So maybe we can just keep an eye on the equality aspects of the rest of the time that we have. So should we, what do you think, people? Shall we just let it flow
Yes, let's
naturally?
just,
What do you think, Mike?
just have questions, comments, discussion, see where it takes us. That sounds great.
Yeah, great. Somebody like to kick off?
I have a question for Adria relating to the very rich data set that you're collecting.
Yeah.
And necessarily you're setting up hypotheses looking for particular types of relationship. I was wondering, given that people often take part in these simulated environments over long periods of time, will you be able to assess change over time? For example, in your results so far, you have the exploratory type as the most frequently followed, with 17 individuals. Over time, are particular individuals likely to change type? And perhaps having spent some time exploring, engage in activities that are more characteristic of your projective type, for example, or vice versa? Are you taking the time element into account?
I am not taking it into account for this particular studies, since it would make the data gathering even more challenging. But I do believe that there can be an element of change over time, not only over time, but also in given specific life events. I do believe that could lead to a shift over the tendency to create their virtual identities in a different ways.
It just occurs to me that one question posed to each participant: how long have you been playing this in this environment? Would allow you later on to do a bit of salami slicing relating time in environment with adherence to a particular typology. I've been taking part in a game for 16 years now. I'm sure I've changed over time enormously in what I've been looking for from my participation in that environment. But yeah, there's a possibility.
We do ask them how long have they been playing, and we will consider it in our data analysis, since it could be, as far as my personal experience, which is anecdotic at best, but it could be very possible that people who are newer to a particular game have a different tendency to create their characters than people who have been playing for years.
Thank
Yeah.
A small methodological question for Adria. Perhaps I missed it, but I wasn't sure whether you were eliciting or supplying constructs.
Yes, yes, I did not mention it. We are eliciting them.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe a question for Claire then, if I may. Sorry, apologies.
Okay.
It's more a thought, I suppose, because the two groups that you've chosen to explore appear to me at this moment to be coming from different perspectives. So the Brexit group is more of a political divide type group, whereas Black Lives Matter is more of an ethic, morally split group around good and evil, good and bad, as opposed to perceived right, wrongs, good, bads. And so I can see the tight connection with the Brexit between both of them having very similar feelings about each other. I just wondered your thoughts on that, the two groups being from different perspectives or philosophical starting points.
So you're suggesting that because it's more of a moral stance from the Black Lives Matter movement, yeah, I mean, I can see what you're saying, but I think there's still like an opposing group, which I think is not necessarily Trump supporters, but that sort of pro-police people in the States. And so I think there's something they're still fighting against in a group form. So although that, yeah, they're very different in what they're talking about, I think there's a similarity there in the groups. I have actually also got some data now. I've been looking also at Trump supporters as well, and looking at climate change. So I think the more variety we can get, actually, we kind of look at your question actually to see if there is a bigger difference.
I suppose the other thing was cults and the implication for in and out groups, and all the work that was done decades ago around those seem to have that overlap.
Yes.
Fascinating.
I mean, like that fusion.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks.
Just a couple of things for Sarah. There's a comment and a question. The comment is, you know, in your descriptions of the pervasiveness and the constancy of the violence that your participants were exposed to, I was reminded of, there's a nice quote by a Sierra Leonean novelist who says, "You call it a disorder, my friend, we call it life." So trauma in a sense is their way of life. But the question was, I wondered if your research has led you to think any more about the constructivist and specifically the PCP models of PTSD.
It's a tough question. I think I've been seeing that there are 4 different ways of engaging with their environment. And I am still struggling to understand how those relate to the models. Certainly when I worked in Sierra Leone, I saw post-traumatic stress in a way that I have not seen in Hanover Park and on the Cape Flats. And I think what I've found is that there's more of an avoidance, an under-elaboration, an avoidance, a constriction around the trauma rather than over-elaborate. Well, the people who are struggling with PTSD, there's an over-elaboration. The people who are coping better, there's an under-elaboration. And so those are some of the things that I'm thinking through and trying to make sense of at this stage.
Under elaboration, that's very interesting. Under elaboration of what?
Of the context, so that they are avoiding and constricting thought around the potential of violence, the types of violence, the possibility of being injured in the violence, if I understand it correctly, yeah. And they would not be seen as experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. although they might have some symptoms of it, there's certainly avoidance. So avoidance is there. And within that group, there is avoidance of engaging with past experiences of violence, so avoidance of their memories. And that's, yeah, they don't engage with past traumas. That's really cut out, and they're able to function within the context, being able to avoid past memories.
Sarah, do the women you spoke to, do they deal with the traumas that their children experience or close family members, or are they avoidant around those contexts too?
Avoidant of those contexts. I think of one who says that her grandson was just at the wrong place at the wrong time and didn't really engage with the fact that his best friend was shot right next to him, didn't engage that his name was called out in the same incident. She simply said, he was at the wrong time, at the wrong place, wrong time, and didn't have empathy or didn't show sociality to understand that this might be traumatic for him. Instead, she spoke a lot about being a matriarch, being in control, strong agency. So there's sort of what I thought is role constriction, investment in her own role as a matriarch and a community worker, and quite cut off from her relationships.
I'm really interested in what you're saying, because when I was a student and we worked for OASA, and we were going out to the OASA stands for the Organisation for Appropriate Social Services in South Africa, so it's the right mouthful. We were going out into the townships and working with the children where the security forces had come in and had shot family members in front of them. And those kids were hiding under the bed and pulled out and shamboked and things. And those processes that you're describing now I recognize those as processes that families were using then, and particularly parents, in order to cope with the ever-present possibility that this could happen again. And so it was like this tremendous event would happen, and then everything would go back to normal.
In fact, that's where this research came from, because clinicians were going back to the 1986 definition of continuous traumatic stress that the Sanctuaries group. The Sanctuaries group were talking about. Jill Eagle and
and all them. Oh, that's interesting. That comes right from back there then.
Ian has his hand raised.
Yes. Well, I found the three presentations very impressive and valuable. Now that we were talking about Sarah's, I had like two questions about your presentations. One is probably due to my limited cultural understanding. When you use the word decency, what do you mean by that? I understand that I wonder if that was a construct used by the users, by the people you interviewed, or it was a category that you used. So in any of the two cases, I would like to understand what is the meaning of decency in the English language culture, because it might not be the same as decencia, which is the Spanish translation of that. So this is one question. Maybe after I make another question, but maybe it's easier if you reply me now.
So I was interviewing in Kaaps Afrikaans, and Sandy might remember ordentlik is the word that they would use. And ordentlik, the opposite for them was chaotic or immoral. So that was kind of the opposite engagement. So then I've had to translate it into English, and the best I've found is decency. It's about being moral, upstanding, and a good member of society.
Okay. The other question is that in your previous answer, you mentioned several times the word avoidance, avoiding. And I have a question, maybe not for you, but not only for you, but also for maybe David and other experts in the terms that would avoidance or avoiding would be like a common psychological word for what we call in personal construct theory constriction. So it are two equivalent words, or what would be the distinction between constriction and avoidance? Sorry, it's a very theoretical question, but I am curious about that, and it came up with your answer. Maybe someone else want to jump in the discussion. I don't know.
I'd value if somebody could jump in.
Well, if you're avoiding something, surely you're not constricting, you're relating to it and rejecting it. But it's not like just pulling your horns in and not considering it.
Okay.
I'm not sure, just top of my head.
I've always seen phobic avoidance, for example, in terms of constriction.
Right.
With agoraphobia, a very clear example of a constrictive process.
Can I ask for clarification? Were the people that you were saying were avoiding, were they adapting better or worse, were you saying, to the context?
They were adapting better, better than those who were extremely overwhelmed.
Yes.
And merged. The word merged came up for me. So there was a group whose past and present, they couldn't distinguish what was happening and how their past traumas were relating to their current experience of violence. They were struggling the most. Those who were constricting were better, but it was still costly. They were not functioning well by any means. In fact, within another society, they might be seen as really not functioning well at all. But within this context, they were getting up every day and they were parenting and they were able to engage. There were 3 people who I felt were coping well, and they were engaging with a high awareness and bipolar construction of their environment.
As I think about it, coming into my mind is Viktor Frankl and his experiences in the concentration camp, and his belief that the way out of such trauma was to create meaning. He invoked Nietzsche. He or she who has a why can endure almost any how. I'm wondering if perhaps what might be called avoiding might be avoiding some things, but embracing some other thing that seems to be creating meaning, like you were talking about the matriarch. The matriarch was seemed almost as unempathic, that somehow she was constricting in a way that helped her to create the meaning. So that maybe what's important to look at is maybe not simply what I'm trying to push away or avoid, but what I'm moving toward insofar as meaning is concerned. And that's easy for some privileged person to say about people who are experiencing things that I would never experience.
Oh, that resonates.
I have also a question. Sorry. Well, I have also a question for Claire, which is a logistic curiosity. Is how did you contact and get the people demonstrating to answer your Qualtrics form online? Because at some point in my mind, I imagine you being there in the demonstration and with paper and pencil and asking some of the the demonstrators to answer your questions. But then I realized that you use Qualtrics, so an online system. So how could you make that connection from the one group to the other, from the presence to the online?
How did I achieve that sample? Yeah, so with the Qualtrics platform, they're quite good at being able to attain the right population for you. So we honed in on the minority groups within the US. And then we had a filter question about, are you a Black Lives Matter supporter? Yes or no. And then I asked them as well whether they were actively demonstrating. But I wanted to look also at those who weren't demonstrating. But it was basically a filter question about whether they were supporters or not.
Yes, I understand, but for me, the practical problem is, how did you reach these groups? Then you ask it if they were demonstrating or not, but how is there like they are forming some sort of network and in which you could contact them and ask them if they would like to participate? How did you recruit them actually?
No, that's how it was. So I initially tried to go to all the chapters of the Black Lives Matter movement, but I just didn't get any response to my emails. So basically it's just Qualtrics, who they have people sort of ready to answer surveys.
The Qualtrics organization.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I had funding for that. So I think that made all the difference. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so just in case it isn't clear, Clare spent very many days, often in the pouring rain, interviewing the Brexit supporters outside the Houses of Parliament.
Yeah, I thought you did.
Yes. that was quite interesting. That was interesting, approaching people. Some people, especially from the Leave side, that was one difference I found. They were more paranoid about being interviewed. They thought I was from the intelligence services and who was funding me, things like that. And there was some aggression from some people. And once you'd met one person, if they saw you working with one campaigner, that would enable some trust. So that helped. But yeah, it was difficult because they'd want to stop all the time to do their campaigning. Obviously, that's why they were there. But yeah, that was an interesting experience. Yeah.
Claire.
Just a question, Claire, how I'm not asking what side of the Brexit debate you took, but how did you maintain your own presence of non-judgment and in that situation where there's two different sides and it's quite a fevering atmosphere around the House of Parliament?
Yeah, it was really, you're right, it's a really fevered atmosphere, and it was quite interesting actually, because when I haven't reported on it here, but I have also done an interview which I did with people, and also just when we were talking through the surveys, and I found myself saying yes, and yes, they all were assuming that I was on there with them. And I thought I did speak to my supervisor about it. Am I leading them? But it's just a natural conversational thing. And if I was directly asked, I would just say, look, professionally, I can't say which way I voted. But they would try and guess and get me involved in discussions with the public going past. So yeah.
Claire, I have a very, very simple question for you.
Good.
What, if anything, do you think your work, your findings, your research can tell us about how to break down the divisions between the opposing parties, Brexit versus non-Brexit, Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, or what have you? Do you think that your findings inform that question? And I realize it's not an easy question.
It's not an easy question at all, no. So what we think is perhaps where there's commonality and superordinate structures. What I did notice was with Brexit, I know you don't live in the UK, but if you lived here, it was a really splitting issue that people would not talk. Well, you wouldn't ask somebody what they voted because, you know, there were people who would stop dating, all this sort of thing, and family, ex-friends, things like that. So it was really difficult. And then COVID came along. And then initially, to be fair, it split a little bit with anti-vaxxers, but initially the whole country was reunited. And it's almost like there was a more important issue. So whether it's looking for sort of commonality and looking for what's more important to people, finding that sort of superordinate structure. That's what I'd like to think, but I don't think that was an easy question.
Yeah, it's really hard because, you know, when we think of getting opposing people on the same side, we often think of, well, maybe if we can get some third issue that they both agree with. But we have that. We have climate change that we all ought to be able to band together with. But even then, we're breaking into different parts. The catastrophe isn't mobilizing.
I agree. I think it's hard to find what that thing would be, but certainly there's some commonality, and it is a difficult point. Yeah.
Just a question probably for all three, and whoever wants to answer can answer. But I shared my research come back about a month ago or a few weeks ago, and it had a fundamental shift in my own thinking, just in terms of the depth of the work. And I'm wondering what impact your own research has had for yourselves personally. You know, what's your key insight? How has it changed you? Or you know, and that's to Adria and anybody who wants to answer that.
But I think for me, it was quite interesting looking at how people, their thought processes they go through to what they, for me, especially with the Brexit, how they come to their conclusions, and the similarity in how people think. And I think also for me, sort of relatively new to psychology and things, become very much less and less judgmental, I think, because you understand that this is what this person construes, this is what they're thinking. So I think that was useful. The other thing I meant to mention actually was about sociality, because there was an amount of sociality between people from the opposing sides realizing what the others were thinking, but there wasn't a lot of that. That was just more an answer to Michael's question. But yeah, I think it's more understanding about how people construe, I think, and how it makes sense to them.
The other two?
I think for me, it's when I was working with people in such difficult circumstances, I really felt like I didn't have an evidence-based approach and I didn't know what to do. And it's been good to have a better sense of how people cope. But also as a South African, we live in a very violent society. And so it's been interesting to see how I myself construct rules for safety, how I map what's safe and what's not safe. And how, going back to Viktor Frankl, how meaning is really important for living in South Africa. And so Viktor Frankl's work has been really important for me as a South African about how do I live in this space, a space that is in a very difficult place right now, as the world is. The world is in a very difficult place. Our politicians are letting us down. And so making meaning is really important. A place where there's an ongoing stress of violence, different forms of violence, structural violence. Yeah.
For me, well, it's been some things, but one thing that really struck me especially during the interviews and when the Repertory grid, something I really noticed is it's a very intimate instrument. People really open up to you, and being able to see all their lives, the different ways and the different things that the game means for every one of them. It kind of reinforced something that I had only been able to imagine up to now, and it's the huge scope that these virtual communities have. People people gather within the game in groups. For example, in World of Warcraft, they get together in guilds, and it's fascinating how much this works as a microcosmos of sorts. Like, they interact with each other, they trade with each other, they cooperate, they compete, they form relationships that, of course, there are flesh and blood people behind every screen, but all they know is the virtual self of the rest of the people in that community. And it fascinates me how how complex and how whole these communities that are merely in a virtual space develop.
Mm.
And I also ask a question to the three of you. It seems to me that the three of you have each discovered and exposed a tremendous amount of knowledge about the dynamics in each of your fields, both at a theoretical and a practical level. So, you know, for example, with Adria, your little triangles are so neat, you know. And I mean, the question I wanted to ask all three of you is from me in the role of a family therapist. Okay, so I've been referred a family in which a member of the family has either been involved in quite violent clashes in a demonstration outside Parliament, or has been involved in drug and violence in an area of Cape Town, or has been involved in getting far too addicted to some computer games. And I'm working with the parents, let's say, about this young person in the family. And I was wondering what chief finding, either at a theoretical or at an empirical level, you would pull out from your research to feed back to the family to say, well, look, I've been doing some research here and I've found some very interesting things about what typically human beings do in these three different scenarios. Does that question make any sense? What would you feed back that would be useful for this family to begin to get their heads around and discuss and understand?
If I might go first, I think for me, the importance of constructing safety, and that we can construct safety in many different ways. And so even if a person is living in a dangerous space, but also drug addiction, and we have dangerous spaces in many different ways, but we can construct safety physically, but also psychologically. And I think that would be different for every person, but that's important. By engaging in a supportive relationship, by finding what's secure for us, and by mapping what is secure for us in our space. And that then will allow space to do other work, whether it's dealing with drug addiction or other things.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's quite a difficult question really to do off the top of my head, but I think perhaps I would, if somebody's involved in some violent outside the House of Parliament to do with groups, I would perhaps look at the groups that that person had started to identify with and why they felt so close or so attached to this group, and maybe look at possibly, you know, at what they're looking for certainty through that. Can you present it in a different way that's not involved with the ideology that they've become involved with?
So the fusion aspects sort of thing.
Yes, probably. And I think also from the PCP side of things, that's just general understanding how they are thinking and so on, to be able to explain that to someone else, I think is useful. Yeah. So
it makes me wonder whether, I mean, maybe you know of research in which this so-called fusion is explained in terms of the kind of relationships that a person might have had in their family. So that, are they looking for a new family infusing into these extreme?
They don't generally they say they project these familial ties rather than that they're particularly searching for a new family. And you can get positive aspects. There are things, if somebody's fused to group, they will do beneficial things as well, but we tend to focus tends to be on the negative. But yeah, I haven't heard about them searching for a new family, rather than it's a similar tie.
Thank you. Adria, if you were working with one of these young people, Would it be useful to feed back your 3 hypothetical triangles?
I think it would, more than the triangles, the concept behind them.
Maybe another aspect.
Yeah, but I think it could be useful for families to really get an understanding about what these environments mean to their children. Yes. In this case, I do believe that there, especially in the past and not so much now, but still a little bit, there has been some stigma on video games. And I do think that a better understanding on how people socialize and more than that, the understanding that people actually socialize within these environments could be very useful. And not trying to frivolize anything here. I mean, video game addiction is a real and very concerning thing, but also to shed light to other more constructive ways of playing.
Adria?
Yes?
I work with neurodiverse children who do a lot of online gaming. And I'm really interested in your triangles, because one of the things that my students find incredibly useful is to take their ideal avatar self and wear them for a day at school with their students, with their peers. And if they are wearing their ideal self, in a sense, it's a form of masking, but yeah, sure. Wearing your ideal self gives you a chance to be different without having your core self disrupted, and being different and being able to explore yourself. So being exploratory within your actual environment. So in a sense, bringing your avatar to life has been an extraordinarily powerful form of therapy for children with social communication difficulties.
Interesting.
So I'm really interested in your research.
Oh wow! I wonder if you could send me some of this research. It would be very interesting. Very interesting.
I can send you anecdotal stuff.
That works.
I don't have. I'm in the process of writing all the stuff up, so I don't have anything published. But I can give you anecdotal stuff if you're interested.
That would work perfectly too. I find it fascinating.
Okay. Well, I'll put my email address in the chat.
Yeah, I can put mine too.
Talk about it. Yeah, and we'll talk about it. Thank you.
Can I ask you 3 presenters, if you have something to ask the audience, maybe there's something that you were hoping would get discussed, or something you'd like to, a puzzle in your own research process that you'd like to see if anyone's got any ideas for.
May I make a comment?
Yeah.
Okay, this is a reaction to Clare study, which is, I found it neat, and I found it very, very correct methodologically, and the approach, and very neutral in your positions. But in my heart, I have some discomfort, some distress. And I think when John Fisher said that in the case of Black Lives Matter, it was an ethical issue. I mean, in your research approach, you were, as you should do, as you should be, neutral. But my question is, why are we all not radical in the Black Lives Matters movement? Yes. Why are not all of us in there? And why do we conceptualize that as radical people? Yeah. I mean, would Martin Luther King's and some other fights for human rights would be considered, because they go to demonstrations and they are in the middle of violence, maybe not creating violence, but they are attacked by police and all that. And there is violence there. Well, they are defending their rights.
Yeah.
So they might be equated to people defending the Nazi values, or, you know, or many other things that I don't want to mention now, but all other things. So I feel discomfort in this neutral approach, which I find from a research point of view correct, but I feel at ease. I feel unsettled.
So background about that was that I really wanted to look at Black Lives Matter, because I think when we talk about radicalization, we can only see, you know, for most people, it's all about Islamic fundamentalism, and that's what it means. It's all negative, and it's very, for the European population, you know, it's very other and things like that. And I really wanted to look at Black Lives Movement, because for me, I feel like you, I feel really strongly that these are freedom fighters. And I felt if we can understand something that's really positive to everybody, hopefully that you can help explain to others about, you know, perhaps Islamic fundamentalism, and you wouldn't be so judgmental. But then I got into some conversations with close friends of mine and who are from sort of the Black community, who felt very, very uncomfortable about it, because they said, okay, so BLM is going to be looked at as a terrorist organisation. I was like, no, because they're doing the right thing. This is brilliant. And they didn't feel like that. And it's true, there are, even amongst, I have to say, some PhD students, I know people who are really against it. And I was so shocked. I don't think anybody would be. So I feel like you, but I did try and take a neutral approach when studying it. But I actually think in presenting it, I have to actually, I mean, I didn't have a lot of time today, but perhaps should have done a bit more to say that, to maybe mention that actually, that I think it's a really important cause and things like that, rather than thinking, oh, they're another example of, and actually I think they're a different example. Perhaps that's what I should have answered to John earlier, actually.
You know, I'm actually kind of surprised, Guillaume, by what you just said. I actually think that there's an awful lot of debate and discussion that one can have on this issue. I don't think that it is at all clear that we should be radicalized or radical Black Lives Matter folks. In fact, you know, my own position, my own feeling is that Black Lives Matter, the way in which we look at it, is not a particularly healing process. It is based in many ways on an us versus them mentality, where one side is moralizing what is right and is convinced that they are right morally, and is not engaging in the type of sociality, I would suggest, to try to look into the heart and soul and values of the other side. I think that needs to happen on both sides. I think that it is essential that police officers and the public look deeply into the lives, the experienced lives of Black people in Chicago, and how they live their lives, and the indignities that they face every day, simply getting up and walking around. I also think it is absolutely important for us to look into the hearts and minds and souls and needs of the police officer. The police officer who puts his or her life on the, police officers have very hard jobs, and they're working with people at their worst. And I encourage people to take a look at the Black Lives Matter website and look at it. You know, imagine you're looking at it from a police officer's point of view, and take a look at what's being said there. That, you know, that a police officer has to deal with. Police officers are leaving the profession in enormous numbers. Do we really think that police officers are evil and bad people in and of themselves? I think we need sociality on both parts, and we need third ways that transcend and get past the dichotomies. I don't think we should be radicalized with one group.
I agree with you, Mike. I think it's really important that both sides can see from each other. But I think when a community has been really oppressed and the other community has all the power, I think that the one who's oppressed, if they're trying to break through, I don't think they'll start by trying to sit down and talk with the others. I don't know. I think it might be a reaction to that, perhaps.
I think there's no other way than to sit down.
I think for a solution.
Yeah, I go back to my own my own history. I love that quote David said earlier on, by the way. You call it trauma, we call it life.
Yes.
So I can empathize with that. But if I go back to the very start of the Troubles in Northern Ireland and look at, there was a just cause from a point of view of the nationalist community and what happened. They were being oppressed. But you have to be very careful then of when does that actually, when does your seeing a just cause turn into violence? What's wrong, what's right? So that position of maintaining neutrality is so important. So important because things can spill over from a just cause to violence. And I've seen that happen where I live. From what was a just cause on the street, what was in America, the civil rights movement happened here as well, but ours turned into a violent campaign for 30 years. So I do think keeping a position of neutrality, as uncomfortable as it might be, is absolutely crucial. Because it's just, we have to explore these things from a neutral point of view, because Michael talks about the third way. I love that idea of the third way, because you just don't know where these things can go if we don't do that, and somebody has to take that position, as uncomfortable as it might be. That's my own thoughts on it. So.
I think it might be useful to just begin to wind up. And has anyone got anything that they want to say about the session that we've had, which seems to me to have been incredibly rich and brilliant discussion? Does anyone want to reflect on this session itself?
Well, I was dreading it, but I found it actually really useful. So thank you for the opportunity. And I really enjoyed the other two speakers as well. I thought their studies were really interesting.
Oh, that's great.
So thank you for that.
Yeah, I also want to thank you for that. Even if it was quite daunting at first. I did really enjoy it, and it was very enriching.
Excellent.
It's been really helpful to be in conversation, and I'm quite awed. So thank you very, very much.
I think this is really useful for other members of the audience as well, to see the new thinking and the new applications of PCP in different environments, ones that perhaps we might never have encountered. I think the whole process is incredibly enriching, having people who are actually doing the research at the moment to come and tell us about it. So thank you very much.
In 2 weeks' time, we have Craig Nunes, who's a critical psychologist who edits the Journal of Critical Psychology, Psychotherapy and Counselling. Comes from a Jewish background himself. He had members of his mother's family perish in the Holocaust. I was rather pleased to be able to inform him that there was an extremely interesting book about rock music, and it's by the social psychologist Michael Billig, part of the Loughborough group. It's called Rock and Roll Jews, and he hadn't come across it before. It's fascinating about the role that the Jews played in the American commercial music industry, first of all in the 30s in terms of the show, the shows like Rodgers Hammerstein and Gershwin and all those, and then in the 50s the role that they played in what was really an apartheid situation in the southern states, between young black and white musicians who were both coming out, who were both in the area of sort of rhythm and blues, and the apartheid was that it was almost impossible to relate to the other community. I've just been reading a book by Bobby Keys, who's the sax player in the Rolling Stones, and he was in Lubbock in Texas, where Buddy Holly was as well, on the Crickets, and he brought back to his family home a couple of black musicians, young people that he'd been playing baseball with, and it was a nice family that he had, but his mother said, well, what are you bringing those guys here? You can't bring those guys into the house. You know, so that the standoff between the black and the white communities in the area of rock music and blues and everything was huge. But the Jewish community came along, or the Jewish composers came along and basically united these two. So it's a lovely example of the third position, where, for instance, all the hits of Elvis Presley, all the early ones like King Creole and Jailhouse Rock and those well-known things where he was using basically black musical forms, but the composers, a huge number of the composers were Jews. Now, I think Craig is going to talk next time about a rather similar situation in psychology and psychiatry and psychotherapy, the psi disciplines, as he calls them. And I actually looked up on the website, Jews in psychology, Jews in philosophy, and the number of Jews that were major contributors to the discipline were, I think it was, for psychology, it was 40%. Anyway, that should lead to rather a good session in 2 weeks' time, which I hope to see you all for. We've been slightly worried about the numbers. It's been encouraging to have 17 today, I think it was. That's a little bit better than last time, where we only got 10 people in the audience. For some reason, things are, the audience numbers are not as high as they were in the first series, but let's see if we can do something about that. If we can't, we may have to change the day to possibly a Tuesday. Friday might be problematic in terms of the weekend coming up and needing to rest after a hard-working week. Anyway, I've been rambling on a bit too long there, sorry. Anyone else want to say anything before we stop?
Just thank you to the presenters. That was brilliant. Thank you. So,
yes, let me thank the three of you again very much.
Have a nice weekend.
Thank you. Yeah, have a nice weekend.
You
Thank
too.
See you all.
Bye bye.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
all the best, folks.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye. Bye.
And well done.
Thank you.
Adria, I loved your passion whenever you seen Sarah, whenever you got very excited there when you seen somebody else talking about your area, so it was cool.
Well, there's a lot with Ireland in around continuous trauma too.
I'm sure. Very good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, folks. Good night.
Take
Good luck.
care. Bye.
Bye.
Grab Sarah.
Cheers.
Bye.
You have, there's 18 people there. There's 18, not 17. Somebody just, I think,
Oh, 18, right.
just captured. So
That's